Welcome to the DAR Museum Online. I'm Sarah Kirspel, the coordinator of museum engagement and outreach for the DAR Museum. And today is part of our monthly Tuesday Talk series, presented on the second Tuesday of the month. We highlight topics related to the DAR Museum's collections, from decorative arts to the American social history to best practices in object preservation. Every Saturday here at the museum, we have a family activity from 10 to 2. This month, it is called Folklore and Flowers, where we explore cryptids from across the country, as well as make some fabric flowers connected to our exhibition. And on Saturdays, we are hosting unfinished objects, commonly known as UFOs, as a craft circle from 3 to 4 p.m. Coming up, we do have some big events. In the evening at the museum on Thursday, October 31st, we are hosting Terror in the Seams, Dissecting Historical Costumes in Film, which is hosted by Alden O'Brien and Kevin Lucas. And on Friday, we begin our first ever 2-day symposium, Making Meaning in Memory, a Sewn in America symposium, which will have virtual and in-person tickets available. These and a full list of our upcoming lectures and programs can be found on our website. Visit www.dar.org/museum and select Calendar of Events, or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at DAR Museum. So now that I've taken care of all of the housekeeping, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Isabella Rosner. Dr. Rosner is a curator of the Royal School of Needlework and a research consultant at Witney Antiques. Her PhD thesis from King's College, London, focused on Quaker women's needlework, waxwork, and shellwork before 1800. Isabella also hosts the So What, SEWWHAT podcast about historical needlework and those who stitched it. And she is a 2023 BBC/AHRC New Generation Thinker. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Rosner. Thank you for being here.
It's still so surreal to be called a doctor, even though that is who I am. Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Also, I would just like to point out that I'm wearing a sampler shirt in honor of today. It is not made from a real sampler, and I just need to make that clear, but it's made to look like a historic sampler, which I think is so fun. Okay. So this presentation today, which will be approximately 45 minutes long, will survey 10 embroideries made by 2 centuries of incarcerated Americans in places like psychiatric hospitals, prisons, missionary schools, and sites of enslavement. Together, these items illustrate embroidery's connection to things like mental health, creativity, and power. And they demonstrate the capacity of embroidery to do things like pass the time, express emotions, calm down, regain agency, distract, reflect, and rehabilitate. And all of these things give those who have lost in these spaces a lot of their freedom, a chance to regain a morsel of this agency. So I'm an embroidery historian. That's what I specialize in. And I find that most of the people I talk to think about embroidery as, an innocent pastime by rich Victorian women, which is indeed part of embroidery's history, but that's only one small part of that very vast centuries, millennia long history. So it's also about embroidery as an opportunity to study people on the margins, to study poor people, to study women and men and girls, to study anonymous people, to study the people who are not appearing that often in the written archive. And that's what a lot of this talk is about. It's about rewriting our understanding of embroidery as this, as cross-stitching home sweet home, and turning it into something bigger and more complex and all-encompassing than that. So with these stories, they're all taking place in the US, and they are very disparate. These stories are bound together by the circumstances in which these people are facing. These are people who are in spaces like prisons and psychiatric hospitals, but the circumstances under which they can obtain their embroidery materials and what they are stitching are oftentimes very different. Sometimes these people want to embroider, sometimes they're made to, and we see both of those things here. And although all of this is pretty disparate, this survey of several centuries is pretty kind of varied, these stories are united by this evident human resourcefulness and this innate human desire to create. And so the presentation goes chronologically. It starts in the early 19th century and it goes for about 200 years. And it's about just the American stuff, as I said before, but really the history, the lineage of embroidery and incarceration is very vast. And there are stories of people embroidering in spaces of institutionalization or incarceration from all over the world for centuries. So I'm going to start us off with this very early American example of an object that speaks to the relationship between embroidery and incarceration. And this is an object that I saw at the very beginning of my journey studying needlework. I was an intern at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and we were doing a survey on samplers. And I saw this sampler, and I'd never seen anything like it. It's really big. Sorry about my lingering cough, by the way. It's really big. It's over 2 feet long and almost 2 feet wide. It's really huge, and it has so much text. I'd never seen anything like this before, and I was confused about what I was seeing because I saw that at the top it says, the substance of a petition presented to W_N_H_T_S Esquire by the wife of Alma Ali Khan, who was put to death in India for political purposes. So I saw this and I was like, okay, India. But then when you look to the bottom right of the sampler, you'll see that it was made by a girl named Hannah Powell in 1813. I didn't know it was a girl at this point. I was just confused about the relationship between India and this name that I considered very not Indian. But what it turns out this is it's a sampler that can also be constituted as an embroidered document, a kind of petition against execution. And what this is a girl who, I believe she is in the US, who is seeing printed material. And I'll tell you in a moment about what this printed material is. She's seeing this long document that was reprinted in around 1813, around 1812, because of the British War of 1812 to kind of engender anti-British sentiment. And she uses this text to not only practice her stitching of letters, but also to express her political beliefs or her family's political beliefs, or those are of her teacher. But the actual source material is incredibly poignant and brutal. And trigger warning for all of this throughout this, this entire presentation. This is a grim subject. And a lot of what we're going to see today are very devastating stories of loss, stories of violence. So I would just like to prepare you all for that. So this document begins, as I just said, with the phrase, the substance of a petition presented to WNHTS Esquire by the wife of Alma Ali Khan, who was put to death in India for political purposes. And it concludes at the very bottom, says, this petition was presented by the unhappy woman to the great man, who, when he had perused it, give orders that Alma Ali Khan should be immediately strangled, which orders were immediately put in execution. Hannah Powell, 1813. And this document, there's a lot of text in it, but I'm going to read you some choice passages that kind of really relay this emotion, and then I'll explain the context. There are phrases like, sentences like, give me back my Alma Ali Khan and take all our wealth. Strip us of our jewels and precious stones, of our gold and silver, but take not away the life of my husband. Innocence is seated on his brow, and the milk of human kindness flows round his heart. Another passage reads, my children, the children of Alma Ali Khan, send their petition for the life of him who gave them life. They petition from thee, the author of their existence, by that humanity, which we have oft been told glows in the breast of European loveliness. So you're probably like, what am I looking at here? Yes, this is a petition that was written by an Indian woman named Almasa Ali Khan. She was the wife of a man named Alma Ali Khan, and he was a Maharaja. In this period, this is the late 18th century that this was originally written in, Britain had, was in its first decades of empire in India. And a man named Warren Hastings, W_N_H_T_S, this name that's at the very top here, I hope you can see this. This is Warren Hastings. He's the Governor General of British India, and he's an extremely brutal ruler. He wants Alma Ali Khan's land, and he doesn't know how to get it. Alma Ali Khan doesn't want to give him his land, obviously, because he rules, this is his land. He's ruling his own region. Warren Hastings jails Alma Ali Khan under bogus circumstances. And Almasa Ali Khan writes this petition asking him to please free her husband. And he says, yeah, sure. Yeah, come on over to the prison. And Almasa Ali Khan goes to the prison and finds her husband executed. He did not survive. He was indeed, as it is said in this petition, executed under Governor Warren Hastings' ruling. So this petition is published widely in the late 18th century throughout Britain and the US, as well as an accompanying poem of great loss that Almasa Ali Khan wrote to commemorate her husband. They were printed widely to commemorate this, to illustrate the brutality of Warren Hastings and British rule in India. And then again, about 20 years later, they were reprinted in the US because there was a lot of anti-British feeling around the War of 1812. So the theory, and I believe this is the correct theory, is that Hannah Powell was a girl in the US who had access to this print material and who had seen this petition, or her parents had, or her teacher had, and they were anti-British, and they had, or Hannah herself chose to embroider this petition, not only to practice her letters, but also to understand how sentences are structured, to understand emotions, and to express this anti-British sentiment. So I need to say here that this first object is not an object that was made in an incarcerated state. It's not embroidery that was wrought in a prison or a psychiatric hospital, but it's about institutionalization. It's about incarceration. So we begin here with embroidery about incarceration rather than incarcerated embroidery itself. But even here, it shows us that even for girls who were undertaking their very formal embroidery education, stitching and incarceration could be and sometimes were joined up. So this is a unique object in the survey in that it's doing something a little bit different. But I think this is the correct place to start this story because it shows us that incarceration embroidery was not just for adult men and women in these spaces. It's for people of all ages, all races, all genders and classes and religions. So speaking of girlhood, I'd like to move on to some other samplers. And these are Native American missionary school samplers. Some Native American girls were forced to attend mission schools that educated them and Christianized them. There was an effort to root out their indigenous culture, their language, and their traditions in order to civilize them. This is part of the Christianizing civilizing process that was being undertaken by white Christian men and women. And I have included incarceration in this conversation about incarceration embroidery, these missionary school samplers, because many of these girls did not attend these schools by choice. These were educational institutions that contributed to the Americanization of Native Americans, which led to a huge loss of language and culture. And if incarceration embroidery is about agency, which it often is, and also about the loss thereof, the loss of that agency, this is an important example. To me, incarceration is not exclusively prisons and psychiatric hospitals and associated institutions. It's about stitching in spaces where you do not want to be. And these are samplers that were made under duress. So we have a sampler on the left here that was made by a girl whose Christian name was Christine Baker. She made this at the Choctaw Mission School, and it's now at Colonial Williamsburg. And on the right, we have a sampler made by a girl whose name was Kutoyi, and her Christian name was Nancy Graves. And she made it at the Cherokee Mission School, and it's now at Historic Arkansas Museum. And I want to talk a little bit about the quotes that we're seeing here in both of these. On the left, we have this phrase that keeps coming up, which is, when shall we all meet again? And surely this repeated phrase of when shall we all meet again is about heaven. It's about meeting your lost family members in heaven, reuniting there. But it's a very poignant reminder also that Native American families in this period were being forcibly removed from their homes as part of the Trail of Tears under President Andrew Jackson, and that these mission schools were built in these new lands that these girls were unfamiliar with. They were moved to different states, and it is there that they attended these mission schools. So the Choctaws, for example, surrendered their claims to the Mayhew area in the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, and that was signed on September 27th, 1830. And that is just 3 months after Christine finished her sampler. So they were given lands in present-day Oklahoma, and they immediately moved there. I believe that Nancy Graves made her sampler in a new home. Christine Baker made it in, it's the last gasps of her land being her own. And I find that incredibly poignant. On the right, Kutoyi's sampler has this inscription that says, "Let Western girls this sampler view, and viewing let them copy too. Learn well to make the way that's good, the path to glory and to God." So there's some very obvious assimilation and Christianization happening here, but it's still othering the maker. She is being made to assimilate into Western culture, but she's still being separated from the Western girls who will look upon her sampler. And I want to put these samplers in context because Native American missionary samplers are rare, few and far between. They all follow this same form, and they're pretty typical of samplers from the 1820s and 30s, but they also are typical of samplers from this period from other colonial holdings, specifically lands that were part of the British Empire. They remind me a lot in terms of look and purpose to samplers that were made elsewhere under these Christian missionary schools. So on the left is a sampler from South India, and on the right is a sampler from Sierra Leone. And these are made by girls who, like Kutoyi and Christine Baker, were brought into missionary schools oftentimes against their will and were forced to learn Christianity and in an attempt to civilize them. So on the left, we see the sampler by a girl named Sarah, who was the teacher. This is her making a sampler to show her students how they should be stitching their samplers. And she mixes together Tamil and English. Sarah is certainly not her native name. This is a Christianized name, and it's the same over on the right here with Lucy Grant. These are people who are showing us that embroidery is a tool for them to be forced into something that is not their native culture or their native language. And in this process, they are learning to be Christianized, to align with these values that poise sampler making as illustrations of piety and dexterity and skill and patience. But in the process, they're losing their identities. They're given names that are not their own. Okay. Also, I just want to say, as like a kind of conclusionary remark about these samplers, I think a lot of people who are familiar with samplers think of them as innocent artifacts of girlhood. And most of the time they are. But samplers are also very helpful, not only because they tell us a lot about girls and a lot about these girls that are oftentimes not present elsewhere in the archive and in other types of history, but they also tell us about more brutal interpersonal relations and global trade and colonization and empire. Samplers are not immune to what was happening in the world in the 18th and 19th centuries, and these are really good indicators of that. Okay. Now we're jumping forward a few decades to an object that's called Ashley's sack. Ashley's sack is an incredibly rare piece of embroidery that is tied to the institution of enslavement. And I'm sorry, this presentation is very grim and continues to be grim. This object is a cotton sack that was made in about the 1850s. And in 1921, a woman embroidered upon it. And I'm going to read you the inscription that she embroidered. She wrote, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother. Ruth Middleton, 1921. This object is the carrier for the most precious possessions given to a mother to her daughter. So Rose was the mother, Ashley was the daughter. They were separated when Ashley was sold and when she was 9 years old, and they never saw each other again. This was before emancipation, obviously. This was when enslavement was running rife, and it took 70 years for this object to pass through the family and for the great-granddaughter/granddaughter, Ruth Middleton, to embroider the story. These objects are incredibly rare. Embroidered objects tied to enslavement are incredibly rare because Objects that were embroidered were oftentimes used until they were tatters. The names of people who made these objects are gone oftentimes. So there are objects that are certainly the work of enslaved individuals, but their labor has been separated from their identity. So we no longer know their names or even who made them. And there is work that's being done on enslavement textiles, which is great. This object is a very, very rare testament to that institution and to the violence of it and to the forced separation of it. But what is extra poignant about this object is it shows us that love kind of goes above all, right? That this object survives because a mother loved her daughter, and this object was treasured by every subsequent generation, and the story was told. And it meant that 70 years later, Ruth Middleton was able to tell that story through stitch. This object was found at a flea market and found by somebody who, I don't think they knew exactly what they were looking at, but they clearly saw the value in it, and they gave it to a historic plantation in South Carolina called Middleton Plantation, because it was their idea, their thought that Ruth Middleton was tied to that place, and it turns out not to be true. But it's now on very long, I wrote Middle Place, it's Middleton Place. It's on long-term loan to the Smithsonian Museum, and it's on display there. And if you're interested in learning about this object, and you should be, because it's such a poignant, important object when it comes to the history of stitching in America, there is a really, really wonderful book, That's All That She Carried, written by a scholar named Tia Miles, Tiya Miles. And it's a deep dive into the story of these individuals and this object. And it shows us how entire worlds, entire lives can be reconstructed through the study of a single embroidered object. Okay. Jumping forward in time again, I want to talk about Joseph Roth. So we're jumping forward about 50 years from the creation of Ashley's sack, but going back in time if you consider when the object itself was embroidered. And this is the first man we meet. I think people think of embroidery as a women's only art form, and that is almost correct. You know, for centuries, it has been almost exclusively women who have stitched, but it's not been only women. Men and boys have embroidered for centuries too. And it's not just men who are in spaces of incarceration. We have samplers from boys. We have men who are soldiers who are stitching. There is a very vast and deep history of men embroidering in the United States and far outside of it as well. So Joseph Roth was a man who was institutionalized in various New York mental health hospitals, and it's likely that he had schizophrenia. He made at least 15 pieces of embroidery. Those are the ones that are known today. And they range in date from 1905 to 1921. He made the earlier pieces while at a place called Ward's Island Asylum in central Islip, New York, and then later at Binghamton State Hospital in Binghamton, New York. And the objects are kind of in private hands, some of them, and then the Binghamton pieces are in the Broome County Historical Society. So there's a man named Stephen S. Powers who's a dealer in outsider art, and he's a leading authority on Roth's embroideries. And he is the person who has done the most research on Joseph Roth. He has not been able to identify specifically a Joseph Roth in any of the asylum records, but he has found a man named John Roth, who appears in the 1920 Broome County census, including the Binghamton State Hospital. So it might be that that is his actual birth name. And the census record lists his age as 69 in 1920 and lists his birthplace as Germany, which makes sense because these objects are embroidered in German. Stephen Powers has determined that he is the only Roth listed in the hospital during this time. And it makes sense that he last appears in the census records in 1920, given that his last piece of embroidery is from 1921. So it is likely that this John Roth man is the Joseph Roth that we see in embroidery. Several of his pieces use this phrase, World Erlöser, which is German, and it translates to world savior or redeemer. So the transcriptions of his textiles reveal, in combination with that phrase, that he had a Messiah complex. And it's also clear from his embroidery that Roth had an interest in architecture and portraiture. I've chosen these two to show the interest in both. Many of his pieces involve just faces or full bodies of famous people, you know, members of royalty, but also people he seems to have known, anonymous individuals. And then lots of the architecture is the buildings that he sees, that he finds himself in. This embroidery is so fascinating because it leads us into this thing that we're going to see again and again, which is this mixture of text and image. Up until now, it's been mostly text. It's been biographical information, and it's been pious verses. But here we're starting to mix how a person thinks with what they see or what they envision. And that mixture of text and image will see us through for the rest of this talk. Joseph Roth's embroidery is important for several reasons. One, it shows us that embroidery is not just for women, including embroidery in these spaces. That brings up a lot of questions about how he got access to these materials. When it comes to embroidery in incarcerated states, oftentimes it's women who are given things like needles and thread as part of official hospital programs, because it has been recognized that needlework is a very helpful way to rehabilitate, to calm oneself, to distract oneself, to pass the time, to feel a sense of progress. There are a lot of benefits to embroidery. But because of embroidery's associations with women's work, historically, it's mostly been women who are getting these embroidery materials. That is not the case here with Joseph Roth. And it makes us want to know how he obtained these materials. Did he teach himself how to stitch? Did he come from the textile trades? Did he learn in school? Was he part of a program? Was he asking for these materials? Who around him was stitching? There are loads of questions and not a lot of answers. And that's kind of the theme of studying embroidery. Embroidery tells us a lot about its maker. It can tell us, in the case of Joseph Roth, what the buildings he was in looked like, what the people around him looked like, what he had in his mind, what access he had to materials, and what thread colors. All of this sort of kind of biographical and more sociological information. But embroidery also leaves a lot of question marks. We don't know the circumstances under which he made these objects. And that's the case for a lot of the pieces in this survey. One thing that I want to note about his use of architecture is we have a lot of depictions when it comes to embroidery and incarceration of life outside of the prison or the mental health hospital, about things totally unrelated, about people voicing, you know, their inner thoughts through words. But not often do we have physical depictions of the spaces in which people found themselves. And it's very, I don't know, poignant to think about Joseph Roth placing himself in the world and looking just beyond the confines of his cell. He's showing us where he is at, and we're not seeing him inside the cell. We're seeing the buildings that he finds himself in, and it kind of feels like we're looking in from the outside, and he is inevitably looking at us from the inside of the cell. So this is Merlin. Merlin is kind of, she remains the most mysterious to me, I think, of any of these people. She is the one that I think about maybe most of this selection of individuals. And it's because there is a lot of hints here about who she was, but there's still a lot we don't know. So Merlin is the pseudonym of a red-haired woman with pale skin. We know what she looked like vaguely, but we don't even know her surname, her last name. She was a red-haired woman who was admitted to Eastern State Psychiatric Hospital in Tennessee in 1948, and she came straight from prison. She was held there for threatening behavior towards her husband and her neighbors. And while in the hospital, she was there for 7 years. She embroidered various garments, and the only things that survive today are this jacket and a scarf. This jacket, I'm sorry about the poor image. There's literally only one photo available online. This jacket is entirely covered in embroidery. It looks like the middle is quite plain, but it's not. It's actually covered entirely in buttonhole stitched circles. These buttonhole stitches look like these cycles, these spirals, and it reminds me a lot of what it must have felt like to be in these spaces, to be confined, to not be able to escape them. But that also speaks to the amount of skill and the amount of labor that's going into these pieces. So the front, though it looks plain, is entirely decorated. And then the sleeves, the back, and the bottom are all decorated in these embroidered scenes. These scenes are a mixture of things taken from pop culture. You'll see that she has depicted things like greeting cards and magazine advertisements. And there are scenes from her own life. There are scenes we can't quite make sense of. There's a scene of a woman in court. We can assume that's her. There's a scene of a female body that's falling through the air. And it has been thought that that is to represent her as well, this feeling of loss of control, rapidly changing circumstances, this vulnerability. The text she stitches, because she does stitch text as well, is oftentimes unintelligible. So we can't quite make sense of what she's thinking. But this is this object that tells us so much about this person while also telling us very little. We don't know her name still, but we can kind of guess at the media that she had access to and her life circumstances because of these kind of vignettes that we see. What's very sad, I mean, again, sorry, it's a lot of sad stuff here. What's really interesting but sad is that in 1955, she was given a medicine called chlorpromazine, which was marketed as a chemical lobotomy, which I think in today's world would not be a good marketing campaign, but back then was very successful. She was given this, and it was found that she calmed down a lot. She became less violent, but she stopped sewing, and she eventually denied that any of this stitching was hers. She completely forgot that she did this embroidery and this sewing, and I find that incredibly sad. When I talk about Merlin, I call that medication a chemical straitjacket, which is interesting given that she has embroidered a jacket before this. The fact that she embroidered a jacket and that is what survives feels rich to me because jackets, outer garments, coats, things like that, they're symbols of protection, of warmth, of comfort and armor and disguise. There is so much that we can think about when it comes to embroidering outerwear, this outward facing garment that kind of shows how you want to depict yourself and show yourself to the public, to the outward facing world. But with this object for Merlin, it's not just about warmth or comfort or disguise or armor. It's also a storytelling device. It's about sharing her outlook and her memories. Now that we're really in our little era of thinking about garments, around the same time in Missouri rather than Tennessee, there was a woman named Alice Eugenia Ligon, and she embroidered this hospital gown. This is a hospital gown that has been embroidered upon and then crocheted. She's done quite a lot of different techniques. So there are sections where she has actually taken out some of the threads of the linen and has kind of done some drawn and pulled thread work. She's crocheted, she's done needle lace, she's embroidered, she's doing all sorts of different techniques with this garment. And we can see here a wide variety of text and image. We see depictions of Adam and Eve. We can see the preamble to the Constitution. We can see religious verses. We can see portraits and names of family members. It's a real mix of religion, personal experience, and like nationalism, which is very interesting because it begs the question, did she have the preamble to the Constitution memorized? Or was that one of the reading materials available in the psychiatric hospital? I don't know. We don't know. But what we do know the maker's name, and we know some of the circumstances under which she lived and went into the hospital. So she was born in Boone County, Missouri, and she worked as a telephone operator and a hospital attendant, and she raised 5 children. She was admitted to the state hospital in Missouri on 2 occasions, and it is not known what conditions she was suffering from to admit her to the hospital. Records suggest that she made this gown during her first stay, which would place her at about 1949. And she was very interested at this point in things like sewing, crocheting, quilting, embroidering. She poignantly gave it as a Christmas gift to her children to remember her while she was away. And that, when I first learned about this object, that really struck me. This, not only this human desire to create, but this mother's desire to be remembered and to remember her children, this object of memory has similar kind of feelings there to Ashley's sack. It's so much about a mother's love and how to pass that on, and the idea of passing it on through stitch. It's about making something for your family when you're apart from each other. And it's similar to a lot of other objects in this talk for its use of text and image and that mixture of personal experience and kind of content that you get from the outside world, things like newspapers, things like books. And there seems to be throughout these objects, and it's present here as well, this desire in many of these pieces to depict others and visually create a sense of community in the case of a very isolating event. Being in a psychiatric hospital is extremely lonely, but a lot of these objects, a lot of these pieces of embroidery involve faces, and it's easy to envision that these stitchers were experiencing more of a sense of community and belonging when depicting people, even if they weren't constantly surrounded by the people they loved. So how to conclude this little vignette about Alice Eugenia Ligon? I guess it's about resourcefulness, creativity, this deep human desire to create, this being drawn to bright colors. This is a very vibrant object. It's a very, it looks like a very happy object. If you didn't know the circumstances under which it was made, you would think it was a very like cheery object. But again, it's about a mother's love and that family connection in the face of a loss of freedom and a very isolating event. Carrying on with the garments, this is a pair of bloomers that's on display. I think it is still on display in Baltimore at the American Visionary Art Museum. There's almost no information known about it. It is believed that this object and the next one in this presentation were worked at mental health hospitals. And the bloomers can be dated to about 1949, same year, because of the tag inside. It's the tag for the Hutzler's department store in Baltimore. And these are women's bloomers, but there's some very interesting gender stuff going on here that I would like to point out. As has been pointed out on the wall label of this object, I don't think I would have noticed it myself, but it literally says it on the wall text. There is a piece of male genitalia made out of flowers down here. Interesting, funny, intriguing. Not sure what to make of that in terms of gender, but there is a lot to think about there. Is it a joke? Is it a wish? Is it just a bit of fun? We'll never know, but it's interesting to think that, these stitchers had very, very rich lives. And with that came things like in-jokes and longings and things that, humor that gets lost on us. But it is interesting to compare this garment to things like to Merlin's coat. And I want to compare it to Merlin specifically because the previous object, the Ligon object, was not made for Alice Eugenia herself. It was made for her children, whereas this seems to have been made for the maker, and Merlin's jacket was also made for Merlin herself. While that jacket is about being outward facing and creating a sense of like stitched armor, this is about secrecy and intimacy. It's about decorating the item of clothing that is closest to your skin and your most private parts. There's something very internally facing about this, whereas Merlin is very externally facing. There's also something to note here about the fact that a lot of the objects that we're seeing in this talk have a wide variety of motif. This is the same flower over and over again, different colors, but it's the same stitch repeated hundreds and even thousands of times. This, I think, is about calming repetition. It's very easy to feel a sense of progress in the embroidery here when you're using the same stitch and the same motif over and over again. You can really see how this is building, how you are getting somewhere with your stitching. This object is very rich to me because there's so little that's known about it. The name of the maker and the wearer, it's gone, but it tells an interesting, intriguing story about secrecy, about humor, about repetition and the calmness that can come with that. Another object that's at the American Visionary Art Museum is this last will and testament, which is dated to circa 1939 to 1940. It is a really fascinating object that tells us a lot about a maker while also telling us nothing at all. So the maker of the last will and testament is anonymous. We don't know their real name, but we can assume it's a woman because she calls herself Queen Gertrude throughout this. And I'm going to read you some passages that are easy to read, and they're really intriguing. I demand London, Europe, foreign countries kill government thieves, relatives. I demand all Americans vacate Europe, also Irishmen, Romans, relatives, foreign. I demand deaths of all Americans, Romans, Irishmen, relatives in Europe, foreign countries. she goes on. January the 4th, 1922, I, Queen Gertrude, demand to be buried both, and my two children, high Episcopalians, John McDade and Kathleen McDade, and will my money to be sent to King George. So my running theory is that this is a woman whose surname is McDade. I have not been able to find McDade. I've not been able to find John or Kathleen McDade. I'm still working on it, but I'm very intrigued to find the identity of this woman and where she would have stitched this and under what circumstances, because we can see her entire thought process here. I want to compare this to one of my favorite pieces of incarceration embroidery ever, and that's the embroidery of a woman named Lina Buller. Lina Buller was in England. She was in a place called Great Yarmouth, which is near the sea, and she was sent to a workhouse against her will in about 1897. She was unmarried. She had cared for her parents. She ran a boarding house with her mom, and her mom died in 1893, and she lived for a few years by herself, and then she got sent to this workhouse in 1897 approximately, and was there until her death in 1912. And while there, she stitched constantly. She stitched, these are incredibly long documents that get rolled up. I have the statistic in metric, and it's 16.6 meters long. I believe that's about 25 feet long. That's just one of them. She covers her embroidery. She covers these pieces in embroidery that's all caps, like this last will and testament. Just compare, no punctuation, all capital letters, reads very stream of consciousness. There's a similar anger, a similar desire to have their voice heard, a similar desire to tell their story through their words, a similar sense of being wronged. And even when it comes to the material, there are similarities. Here you can see that there are multiple strips of fabric, and it's here the same. Lorena quilts these pieces together and then stitches upon them. Both of these makers have delusions of grandeur. So Queen Gertrude calls herself Queen Gertrude. She's probably not a queen. And Lorena Buller calls herself the daughter of Queen Victoria. Queen Gertrude also demands to be buried in Westminster Abbey. And there are similar sentiments from Lorena Buller. These are women on completely opposite sides of the Atlantic and at different periods of time, but they are reaching similar aesthetic conclusions, which I think is very interesting when you think about that kind of innate human desire to create and to stitch. This last will and testament, I think, shows us that embroidery has the capacity to be a tool of documentation that is more permanent, impactful, and possibly even accessible, if a pen and paper are not, than that pen and paper. And there is a theme in the history of incarceration embroidery to kind of stitch one's like receipts, to stitch out one's life and the ways in which they've been wronged, in order to seek out better circumstances. It's also important to note that while embroidery is a more possibly permanent and sometimes more accessible way of documenting something than using a pen or paper, it's so much slower. So while both of these documents read as very stream of consciousness, it would have taken hundreds and thousands of hours to write them out. So these are objects from people that are, they have fast thoughts, but they are stewing in their emotions. They are stewing in their feelings and what they feel they deserve, being buried in Westminster Abbey, etc. Second to last story here. This is a fragment of the St. Joseph embroidery. There is very, very little information about this, and there's even less good photography, so I apologize. This is, all of these objects are pretty hard to get access to good photos of, and this one is the hardest. This embroidery was worked by a Black American woman with schizophrenia in the State Hospital No. 2 in St. Joseph, Missouri in the 1960s. Little is known about the patient, and it has been kept not public knowledge on purpose. We know that she was mostly mute, but she spoke when she was not happy or when her routine changed. The embroiderer was admitted into the hospital in the 1940s, and she was in her 30s then. She was in St. Joseph Hospital for 30 years before she was transferred to a nursing home in the 1970s. This object is worked on a hospital dishcloth, and it's stamped State Hospital No. 2. And it's covered in these stitched words in a variety of colors, and the text basically makes no sense. You get words that come together, but it seems to be fragments of thoughts or words rather than complete sentences. And what's really interesting to me here, and with multiple other objects in this kind of presentation. You can see the hand of the maker in both the stitching and the writing. Here especially, you can see that this is kind of exactly how this woman would have written using a pen or paper. That seems very personal, whereas the Last Will and Testament is kind of, it's all caps and you get little bits of one's personal writing style. It's mostly uniform, whereas here it's much more about upper and lowercase and writing like you would with a pen. And this is this rare instance of an institution keeping a patient's identity purposely private rather than losing their identity, which other institutions have. Merlin, for example, that documentation is gone, and that's why we don't know her name. This shows us that there are differing relationships between people, personhood, their institutions, and a passage of time. What gets lost, what gets preserved, and what gets not shared, what stays private on purpose. Yeah, I think this object is very interesting, and it too reads like a very long diatribe. It's just a diatribe that doesn't make that much coherent sense. This is a person's diary. It's just that we don't share this person's language so much. Okay, last object is the most recent object, and this is the work of a man named Ray Matterson. Ray Matterson was jailed for robbery in the late 1980s, and he stayed in prison for 7 years. And 1 year in, he got really bored and he taught himself how to embroider. And this was because he was bored in his cell and he remembered his grandmother being really absorbed in her sewing. He has this quote where he says, "I can still see the red shawl, her tan sewing basket, the balls of floss, and the metallic sewing hoops." At the same time, when he was really bored, his favorite American college football team, the University of Michigan, was going to the Rose Bowl. So he is a Michigan native and he wanted to do something to show his team pride. He taught himself how to embroider. He borrowed a sewing needle from a prison guard and he unraveled socks and he stitched a Michigan M in the team's colors of yellow and blue. He used cotton fabric from boxer shorts and handkerchiefs, and he made a round stretcher for his embroidery by cutting off the top ring of a plastic jar using toenail clippers. Clearly, there is ingenuity and desperation here, this deep need to create. Hilariously, his prison mates called him Betsy Ross. In a good way, they liked that because they would trade him things like cigarettes and coffee for his embroidered patches. He, in prison, embroidered these tiny scenes. They're only a few inches long and wide, and they use thousands of stitches. And he left prison in 1995, but he's still a full-time embroidery artist, and he still creates these tiny scenes using unraveled socks. And I love ending these sorts of presentations here because not only I see the most contemporary, but also in this landscape of quite dire and grim stories of embroidery and incarceration, we have a story of hope. We have a story of somebody finding embroidery and loving it so much that they actually make it their entire life after they leave prison, after they are free. These stories are really dark, but I also have to view them a bit optimistically to think about the fact that in incarceration embroidery gave and still gives people who are incarcerated a chance at agency, at independence, at feeling like they are doing something for themselves, at making something, at calmness and repetition. There are a lot of benefits. There are also lots of benefits to studying incarceration embroidery because this stitch captures the experiences of individuals and these stories that so much of other embroidery history does not capture. These are the stitches of women and men who are outside of places like the domestic sphere or the professional workshop or the typical classroom. These are people who are expressing their anguish and their ambitions through stitch. Much embroidery was the work of leisured, rich women in the home, not all of it, but a lot of it was. But to limit our understanding of this art form to just that group of people would be to dismiss the experiences of so many men and women who used embroidery to do all of these many positive things, to pass the time, to express their anger and their creativity, to find that peace in repetition, to create something that will outlast them, etc., etc. The list goes on forever. There is room in embroidery for things like anger, sadness, desperation, and the longing for a better, different life. Embroidery, I always say this and it sounds dramatic, but I think it's true. Embroidery is everything. Embroidery tells us to embroider is to be human, and to study embroidery is to study humanity. And now I'll be done. I'll get off my soapbox and I can answer some questions.
All right. Well, we have some really good questions that
Okay.
I saved for you. So first one is
Thanks.
sampler from Kutukai with the words, it says Western girls. What would she have understood as Western? Is that Western part of the United States, the Western world, or like rodeo girls?
Western, like whiteness, basically. Western, like non-Indigenous Americans by this point. So she is, yeah, she's speaking to, the children of the immigrants who came to the New World, basically.
Okay. And Tina has another question. This one's about the Roth sampler.
Yes.
How did he get access to the print of the institution's buildings, a print that he clearly copied?
Great question. I do not know. This is the case for, I have a lot of questions about how these people had access to printed material throughout this presentation. Loads of examples. Alice Eugenia Ligon, did she memorize the preamble to the Constitution, or did she have access to a book to the Constitution? Did Joseph Roth have prints or drawings? Was he able to get outside of the building when during time off, like in his leisure hours? I don't know. The thing that's frustrating about a lot of these pieces and a lot of these people is information is so scant. Embroidery from in these incarcerated states oftentimes stands as the only artifact, the only testament to these people's lives outside of census records. And that's very exciting because it tells us a lot about the maker, but these objects kind of exist in a very in a landscape that's really absent of other information. So I actually unfortunately have no idea how he would have gotten prints or drawings.
Related, I think it's more of just a comment, but Donna says that in regards to the Alice Ligon garment that was done in 1949, the seamstress grew up
Mm.
in a time when every school child memorized the preamble to the Constitution, which is hard for today's younger generation who grew up without civics to believe, but she may have been revisiting a childhood memory.
Yeah, that's so true. Like I had to memorize the preamble to the Constitution when I was a child, and I could still say part of it. And so maybe, I talk a lot in this presentation about how these are isolating spaces, but they're also very boring. So it might literally be that she is just bored out of her mind and she is racking her brain, being like, what do I have off the top of my head? I think if I was in that situation, I would I may also cite the preamble to the Constitution or like the 50 digits of pi I like have memorized. I think, a lot of these pieces speak to a sense of desperation. And I think that that does too, this kind of just being so bored. And whether she had access to the Constitution in front of her or whether she had to access it through her mind, it felt this, including the Constitution. Yeah, maybe she's thinking about civics. I tend to think she's just bored and is desperate to decorate.
Well, she's doing it for kids too, so maybe she was like, well, they need to
Yeah.
know the preamble
Maybe
to the
she's like,
Constitution.
what does it mean to be a good American? Which is
Right.
also actually kind of a surprising theme that comes up in several of these pieces. Joseph Roth is an immigrant, but he's constantly stitching American flags. There is this theme of American identity and placing yourself into American society.
Another question is, can you tell if any of the diary samplers have a pencil underdrawing or were they embroidered without underdrawing?
None of the ones that I have seen have an underdrawing, which is so wild when you consider the amount of skill necessary to plan out how many words can fit in on a line. So the Queen Gertrude Last Will and Testament, you can see that she sometimes gets a little funky with it and she has to make her letters smaller because she kind of underestimated how many words she could do on a line, or overestimated rather. But for like Lina Buller, for example, no pencil marks there at all. And she has I think it's something like 1,000 lines of text. And at no point is her text getting smaller or is she splitting things up. Like every so often, she'll have a little caret to include something. But there seems to have been an immense amount of mathematical reasoning that had to happen to create these objects in a kind of aesthetically cohesive way. They're really so they're not only testaments of people's lived experiences and desperation, but they are showing that people were really good at spatial awareness and reasoning.
Another question is curious about the yarn used in the prison samplers. Was it supplied by relatives? Was it obtained in prison?
So seems like all of them have different are under different circumstances. So you have people like Ray Matterson, who is unraveling socks. You have lots of other non-Americans who are doing the same thing. Arthur Bisbo de Rosario, Merlin is using her uniform as the base for her jacket. When it comes to the yarn, Some people are unraveling the uniforms or the bed linens. Lina Buller, for example, is part of a scheme that's so she's in the Great Yarmouth Workhouse in England, and there is a scheme that's going on called the Barbizon scheme, where people will donate fabrics for people to embroider upon or use to create quilts. So she has access to a large pool of materials because she's part of an official program. Lots of people, though, I don't know how they get stuff. Like Merlin, we can assume that that was given to her as part of an official program. I don't, for so much of this, I just don't know. And sometimes you can see, well, there's this one specific example that is not American, so I didn't include her, but she is my number one. And her name is Annie Parker, and she was arrested more than 400 times for drunkenness. She spends years of her life in prison, and she embroiders samplers using her own hair. And that is an interesting example of us trying to figure out, did she do this as like self-flagellation thing, to try to, it's this kind of using the pain of plucking out her hair to then stitch herself better, to like really be very mournful about her circumstances, and to, talk about the regret of her actions. Maybe it's that, or maybe she is not getting thread and she is so desperate to stitch that she has to pluck out her own hair. That's one example that's not in this presentation, but it's all to say that it seems that everybody had a different set of circumstances when it came to accessing materials, but I can't find that information anywhere in the records thus far, stinkily enough.
I think we're on our last question, then a couple comments, but are these pieces featured in your book, Stitching Freedom?
Yes, most of them. So Stitching Freedom has 12 stories, and they're from all over the world. So there are a few pieces in this presentation that aren't in there. Like, I don't talk about Hannah Powell. I don't talk about the Native American missionary samplers. I don't talk about the St. Joseph Embroidery or the American Visionary Art Museum stuff. I would say about half the objects in this presentation are in Stitching Freedom, but then also in Stitching Freedom, or maybe even less than that. I don't talk about Joseph Roth either. I talk about Ray Matterson in it. I talk about Merlin. I talk about Ashley Sack, and then I talk about 9 stories from other parts of the world. So there's quite a few stories from Britain. There's a story from Brazil. There's a story from Serbia. So I wanted to have a more international look, but I actually relished this opportunity to talk about just America to you fine daughters of the American Revolution folks, because it made me realize in a way that I hadn't before just how vast the specific history of American incarceration embroidery is.
Great. So fascinating presentation. Tina says, embroidery is a fascinating way to get at people at the margins who otherwise have no agency. It reminds me of prison tattoos in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is her research topic,
Cool.
Also about love and community and values and sex. So she thanks you for your thoughtful and poignant presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Learned a great deal. Just thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Can I plug one organization if you're interested in the history of embroidery and incarceration?
Absolutely.
So this is first of all, thanks everybody. This is very nice of you. This is a British organization called Shellwork. It is an organization that is in existence today that goes into prisons and teaches prisoners how to embroider, and those objects are for sale, and it gives the prisoners both money and skills for once they leave jail. So if you're interested in learning about how embroidery in prisons is happening today, I would recommend you look at their work. I love them. So that's
FINECELLWORK.
Yes,
Fine Cell Work.
Fine Cell Work. I just had a podcast episode with them. If you want to learn more, I just am constantly promoting them because I think their work is really helpful, and it also makes us realize that embroidery and incarceration is not a thing of the past. It's still happening today.
Absolutely.
Something like that. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you to all you joined us. You can be looking for this on our website. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.